Hi, my name is Nancy MacLean. I'm a professor of history and public policy at Duke University, and I live in Durham, North Carolina. And the book that I am here to talk about is Democracy in Chains, which is really the backstory to our pretty terrifying times. And although it's a work of history, it turned out to be sadly predictive of how our democracy came to be so embattled and so vulnerable, and why we are finding it so hard to take action, even on the prospect of ecological collapse, something that so many of us are so concerned about. And particularly as each summer seems to be hotter than the last one, we keep hitting records for global crisis, and yet we are at an impasse in our politics on dealing with that. So that is kind of the story that my book conveys, or the situation that it makes sense of. But the story itself is really at its core about two men, a thinker and a CEO. And the thinker was a man named James McGill Buchanan, who was an economist who spent most of his career in Virginia public higher education, ironically, and went on to win the Nobel Prize in economic sciences in 1986. And the CEO is Charles Koch, one of the wealthiest men in the world, who has built Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, and who has been, since the 1960s, investing in how to change the world in order to secure a libertarian future. And believe me, as I get into this, you will see that the libertarian future that he wants is not what most of us would think about. If we were thinking about freedom, we might think about freedom from domination. But the future that he and his fellow donors in the Koch network of donors is trying to bring in is about a future that will leave corporations and wealthy people free to dominate the rest of us. So my story tracks this relationship that develops between these two men at the tail end of the 1960s, and shows how by the late 1990s, Charles Koch turned James Buchanan's ideas into a strategy, a step-by-step integrated long game for shackling democracy so as to entrench corporate power. Now that seems wild. How could that be? Who would do that? So let me say a little bit about how, because we've been watching that how unfold with particular velocity since 2009. After President Barack Obama was elected, and we saw the Tea Party reaction to that, which was also funded by Koch money. They helped to organize a lot of that. But they have also been at work steadily changing the rules of our democracy. Because James Buchanan taught Charles Koch that if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, and here you have to recognize, and I'm not joking or exaggerating, I'm a historian, libertarians do not like the 20th century's worth of public policy. James Buchanan said, if you don't like the outcome of public policy over a long period of time, stop thinking about who rules, the particular individuals who are elected and preside at the top, and start thinking about the rules of the game of politics and government, and how you can change those rules to secure the outcomes that you want. And that is exactly what we have seen in America since the 2010 midterms, what President Obama called a shellacking, where a Republican Party that has been all but taken over by this donor network and the kind of MAGA base that we've seen from President Trump, they've created a kind of pincers action of the donors from the top and of the MAGA base from the bottom that has transformed the Republican Party. What they particularly did in the 2010 midterms, was to get control of a majority of state governments, to invest huge amounts of money to get control of state governments, and then to put into effect the most radical gerrymander our country has ever seen. And many journalists and political scientists have written about this in something called Project Red Map. Then once they had misrepresented the people in the states of those, then it was 32 states. Then they did things like undermining union power, particularly teachers' unions and public sector workers, putting into effect voter suppression legislation, the likes of which we've not seen in this country since Black men were driven from the polls at the turn of the 20th century, privatization of public resources to change power relations so the corporations would be wealthier, the people would be more fractured, and on and on and on. And by the way, one of the things that they've done too is to try to stop any measures for environmental protection and to undermine transparency in government, particularly involving those areas. And that's very important because Koch Industries is based in the fossil fuel sector. So Charles Koch has also been, since at least the 1990s, researchers have found a leader in funding organizations to undermine science and make us not understand or believe that we face the grave threat to our planet that we do. So he's actually at this point invested more than ExxonMobil in that enterprise, funding organizations from the Heritage Foundation to the Cato Institute to the Federalist Society to the State Policy Network. I could go on, Heartland Institute, but funding a lot of this climate science denial and efforts to stop action on the climate. Okay, so you get that power at the state level. Oh, and by the way, I should say they've done things to undermine the independent judiciary in the states. You get that power at the state level, and then you can use that power against national government. So many people felt frustrated with the government of Barack Obama and have frustrations with the administration of Joe Biden. But what a lot of people don't see is how this radicalized Republican Party, essentially doing the bidding of these radical right mega donors, dark money donors, they have done things like organize a group called the Republican Attorneys General Association, RAGA, which sues the national government to stop policies that all of us want to see. So many, many things like that. And actually, the ultimate end game of this is a constitutional convention. They actually want to get the first constitutional convention in American history since 1787 in order to alter the Constitution to lock in these shackles on the will of the majority, because they understand that the majority would never want the world they're trying to bring into being, a world of privatized, no more public education, private schools, you pay for them out of pocket, Social Security privatized, Medicare privatized, no action on the environment, cutting corporate regulation, all of those kinds of things. Those aren't popular. That's why you need to change the rules, and that's why they thought it was so important to get control of the Supreme Court, which there is now a 6-3 conservative majority that is issuing decisions completely out of keeping with the public will and what the public wants on matters from abortion to environmental protection and workers' rights and more. But anyway, the ultimate end game is this constitutional convention, which I've actually just written about in a new preface to Democracy in Chains that's come out this summer. It talks about that push for a constitutional convention. And they now have 28 of the 34 states needed under Article 5 of the convention, and are also moving to what we could call a new math, but what they call aggregation. So they are going to try to take all of the authorizations for a constitutional convention going back, and I'm not joking, to New York from 1788. Anyone that doesn't have restrictions on it, they're going to claim as enabling their push for a constitutional convention. So this means that the stakes of the 2024 election are huge. It is not just about the president and who sits on the top of the ticket. If Congress switches into the hands of this radicalized, MAGA majority Republican Party, they have made very clear that one of their first items of business will to get this constitutional convention so that they can get this locked in a way that the rest of us will not be able to undo. And by the way, they've had practice sessions, groups like it's called the Convention of States, just this week had a second practice session for a constitutional convention in colonial Williamsburg. So that is really, needless to say, scary, serious stuff, like all hands on deck, emergency for democracy. But here's the interesting thing. I never set out to write the book that I wrote. I was actually pursuing a different story. When I started the research for Democracy in Chains in 2006, I had never heard of James Buchanan. You probably haven't either. Kind of flew under the radar. And I had never heard of Charles Koch, who we only learned of from the great investigative journalism of Jane Mayer at the New Yorker and in her book Dark Money, after she started tracking this in the Obama years, along with some other people. The story that drew me into the research that led me to the conclusions I've just shared with you was something else. And I only found these two men and their incredibly important roles over the years. The story I started to research was a school story. It was in Prince Edward County, Virginia, and it was about how there was an incredibly successful strike among Black high school students for a decent high school. And there was a partnership between a brilliant young woman, Barbara Rose Johns, and her favorite teacher. And these students went out on a walkout in 1951 in 100% solid strike. The entire high school walked out to get a decent school. Well, that case became one of the 5 cases folded into Brown versus Board of Education, the major desegregation decision that came down in 1954. And the way the white county leaders responded to that edict to desegregate the schools was to shut the public schools down entirely for 5 years and leave all those Black children, 1,900 children, with no education at all for 5 years, while they took public resources and shifted them over to a private segregation academy and relied on state-funded tuition grants for private schools that were part of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. That enabled these private segregation academy vouchers. So I'm a social historian, a political historian. I study social movements. When I came across documentation of this strike and this reaction to it, I was embarrassed that I had never heard about it before. I was moved to the core. So I started to dig in. And very quickly, I found that the famous libertarian economist Milton Friedman had entered that battle in 1955 with a manifesto for tax-funded vouchers for private schools, knowing full well what he was abetting in the South. So then I thought my story was Milton Friedman. But then as I dug in more, I found that this James McGill Buchanan had gone to the University of Virginia in 1956 to set up a new free market, secret donor-funded center at the University of Virginia. And he entered the fight on the schools just after a massive parents' mobilization of white parents to save the schools, the public schools of Virginia, because the governor was closing down any school that desegregated. So I thought, what kind of person would do this? Would enter, what kind of scholar, what kind of professor, would enter on the side essentially of massive resistance, but make the case in economic terms. So I started following this James Buchanan. I learned more and more. I learned that he advised the government of Augusto Pinochet, the military junta in Chile in 1980, on how to design a constitution to come back to representative elections, but lock in everything that the dictatorship had done, including the privatization of education, the privatization of Social Security, and more. Then I started following the organizations he was connected to, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, all of these libertarian groups, and so many numbers, and their kind of international analogs, and all of that led me to Charles Koch, who was the major donor for so much of this. And so finally in 2013, I got into Buchanan's private archives at George Mason University and found the documentation for all of this. And I have to tell you, it just took my breath away. I had to tell myself to breathe as I was going to the copy machine with many of these documents because they were just so stunning. But so that is the story of how looking at the fight against desegregation and the fight to deny these students an equal education, these Black students, from the 1950s, led me to the crisis of our democracy today. And I think that that connection is especially fitting right now because right now in our time, in 2021, 22, 23, we've seen a similar attack mounting on public education that very much echoes that attack from the late 1950s and early 1960s. And once again, we see a push for privatization. We see actors on the right in organizations funded by Charles Koch, like Christopher Rufo, who are going out to try to stir up a moral panic about teaching honest history, about racial injustice in our schools, and who are using that in order to undermine public education. And you won't be surprised if you're a teacher and you've been facing this, or if you're a citizen who's just been watching with horror in the news, all the book bans, all the things that Governor Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, you won't be surprised to know that they're applying the playbook that I describe in Democracy in Chains, and that these organizations like Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education, all of them have funding from these dark money donors of the Koch network. So again, all of the things that we care so deeply about, right? Our children, our grandchildren, the future of our planet, the future of our public schools, our retirement security, the quality of our air and water, all of these things are at stake now. So I just want to encourage anyone who watches this video to realize that this is a make or break moment. This is one of these points when history is going to go to a very ugly place, or it can go to a place and release all the pent-up energy for reform, for change, to get a sustainable world, a sustainable economy that helps everyone, that provides for all our children, and preserve the most precious natural resources that we enjoy now. And in fact, as I was writing this book, in my hopes, the stories I foregrounded, I wanted to see the coalition that could protect us from this moment come into being. That was my hope as I was writing. And so I made sure to include all the different constituencies that would be part of that, because in fact, we were there before. As a historian, I know that battle to save the public schools in the 1950s and 60s brought together so many good allies. And we can see that again. And in fact, we have seen that in the 5 years since the book came out. Not to say that the book is responsible. Donald Trump mobilized, millions of people to take democracy seriously. But in that time, since then, we have seen people realizing what the stakes of all this are and coming into action more than ever before, working together in coalition. And the 2018 midterms, the 2020 election, the 2022 midterms, all of these things have seen mobilizations of people who realize that really our democracy and our world are threatened, and that we can reclaim them if we come together. So that's the story of Democracy in Chains in a nutshell. Thank you.